you hear very much in the rhetoric of Israeli politicians, Hamas are Nazis, or even Palestinians are Nazis. They want to wipe out, constantly. It's they want to throw the Jews into the sea. They want to wipe out Israel. If we do not act, we will be destroyed. This is the narrative, and thus, I've spoken that there from the right to the more liberal Zionist perspective. You often hear, and the liberal Zionist perspective, it's yes, the destruction is a tragedy, but sadly, the destruction of Gaza is a necessity because that's what happens when you are facing an existential threat. You must do things, as in the Purim story, right? You must do things that are unpleasant, but that are necessary for survival.
Yes, and part of my argument, my book is an argument against that. Not only a moral argument, but also an argument from Jewish self-interest, because I do care very deeply about Jewish safety, about the safety of my people. And just at a kind of a childlike level, I think there's a fundamental flaw in thinking that you can make yourself safe by making the people who live next door to you radically unsafe. Because that system of violence, which has now reached, just apocalyptic proportions in Gaza, produces violent resistance. That doesn't mean I would justify this targeting civilians, what was done on October 7th. But the truth is that system of violence is likely to make everybody less safe. And I think that's how I read political science literature on divided society.
What's the Auden line that you quote? About what was this?
Yes,
you'll remember it.
I think it's the line. It's to those whom evil is done, do evil in return.
Which is valuable both as a caution to Israelis about avoiding this narrative of perpetual victim, right? Those to whom evil has definitely been done, that is, those who fled and survived the Holocaust, but also crucial in understanding the Palestinian reaction to the Israeli occupation. I mean, you talk about, at one point, you profile a Palestinian who hated Hamas, despised Hamas, in his bones, and then after, so much violence, finally tips to the point of, well, now I support armed resistance.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a human response. I mean, and this is part of why I argue in my book that the more revolted and upset you are about the targeting and kidnapping of civilians on October 7th, the more emphatically you need to support Palestinian resistance that's ethical, by which I mean violence, Palestinian resistance that conforms to international law, right? Whether boycotts and sanctions or nonviolent marches or going to the International Criminal Court, or even violence that respects the laws, the norms of international law. Ukrainians have the right to fight Russian soldiers, right? But not Russian civilians, right? And the same thing goes to Palestinians who are having their land seized by Israeli soldiers. And I think, but the problem is the mainstream American Jewish community and most American politicians simultaneously condemn Palestinian armed resistance against civilians and fight fiercely against any other form of Palestinian resistance, even when those other forms of Palestinian resistance don't threaten the lives of Israeli civilians.
Yeah, I mean, you highlight things like, for example, the Israeli response to the 2018 Gaza Great March of Return, which was a very largely peaceful protest in which Palestinians did follow the kind of Gandhian path of, well, what are you going to do? Well, they decided to march to the wall and tried and sort of symbolically cross over. And the Israeli response was to get out snipers and shoot them, some in the legs, but some not in the legs. 200 people were just shot to death.
Right. Yeah, and the way it was depicted was, well, maybe they're marching nonviolently, but they want to leave Gaza and return to the land they're from, so that is inherently a threat. Even if they're not harmed, just the idea that they may want to go back to the land from which their parents or grandparents expelled inherently makes them a threat. And that's the problem, seems to me, with this entire discourse, which is based on the idea of Jewish supremacy, is that the notion that Palestinians would want things that in other contexts we would see as entirely legitimate and normal, right? To be able to return to lands from which you were violently expelled can only be understood as an existential threat to Jews.
And there's more where that came from at patreon.com/current affairs. Go there, subscribe to the Current Affairs podcast. Current Affairs is an independent, non-profit media organization. We need your support. Thanks for listening.